Good evening, everyone. I'm Manik, Honorary Assistant Registrar of the Bangalore International Mediation, Arbitration and Conciliation Center. I welcome you all to this webinar today. I also welcome Mr. Harishankar Moosath, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Consultant Clinical Psychologist from the Christ University, Bangalore. I also welcome Mr. Shiv Kumar, Advocate, Mediator, and Master Trainer, Bangalore Mediation Center. Before we proceed to the webinar, I'd request Mr. Thiru, Honorary Director of BIMAC, to say a few words. Thank you. Mr. Thiru?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I don't want to dwell much on this topic because we have invited an expert to talk about it. I'd like to say a few words about BIMAC for those who are not aware what BIMAC is all about. BIMAC is India's one and only global, not-for-profit, comprehensive alternative dispute resolutions institute. We provide here domestic as well as international mediation, arbitration, neutral evaluation, collaborative settlement, mentoring, and conflict management program. We are associated with several ADR centers around the world as well as colleges and universities in India and abroad. BIMAC was launched over 6 years ago and this, in a short span of time, has gained a lot of popularity, and several commercial organizations all around the world have started using BIMAC rules and ADR programs of BIMAC, right from maybe from Brazil up to Hong Kong. One may ask as to why we call this Bangalore International Mediation Center, International Mediation, Arbitration, Conciliation Center. Bangalore is the brand. And above all, Bangalore is the hub of mediation in India. We have, apart from BIMAC, we have India's largest court annex mediation center, the Bangalore Mediation Center. It's one of the largest single unit mediation center, doing a tremendous amount of job. The largest congregation of mediators in Bangalore. Apart from that, there are 2,500 mediators in Karnataka. And there are 6 master trainers of mediation, all from Bangalore. And there are several very popular mediation centers, apart from BIMAC, all based out of Bangalore. So one cannot deny Bangalore is a global brand, and that's why we have this name. We have the main speaker, Professor, with us, and also the moderator of the evening is Ms. Shiv Kumar. As Ms. Manik had already said, he doesn't require introduction, but as a formality, is a lawyer with more than about 5 decades of practice, 15 years or so as a mediator and a master trainer, and he is going to be the moderator of this evening. I hand over the program to Mr. Shiv Kumar, and I hope you will enjoy this evening and learn a lot from the experts here. Thank you.
Thank you, Thiru. A very warm welcome again to all the participants. It's a great pleasure to have with us Dr. Harishankar Moosath. He is an assistant professor of psychology and consultant clinical psychologist at the Christ University. He has been certified by the Rehabilitation Council of India to practice as a psychologist. He has completed his MPhil in clinical psychology from NIMHANS and is currently pursuing his PhD in the field of neuroeconomics. He has been actively involved in facilitating courses such as law and ethics in clinical psychology, family therapy, and research for postgraduate students at the Christ to be deemed university. He has also developed 2 Android applications known as Inside the Out, Know Your Psychology, Concepts Inside Out, and Summarizing Psychology. Apparently, the prime object of this application is to disseminate knowledge and help students of psychology prepare for competitive examinations. His areas of interest include neuropsychology and neuroeconomics, especially the use of technology in neuropsychological assessment and rehabilitation. Added to all this, he is a avid traveler. I have no clue where all he has traveled. We will probably learn from him what he has done in those travels, and he is also a photographer. Professor Harishankar has been given reasonable inputs on what the mediation process is. All of us who are mediators have been taught and trained the importance of trust and faith in the mediator by the parties. We have also faced at some time or the other situations where parties have suddenly appeared to have lost faith and trust in the mediator. These are situations that all of us mediators have faced during our mediation processes. For those of the participants who are not mediators, trust and faith continue to hold a prime place in their daily lives. So trust and faith is not applicable only to the mediation process, but it is a sine qua non, perhaps, of life itself. What Professor Harishankar will do today is to lay out for us the psychological inputs that are required. He will be giving us some insights into not only building up the trust, but more important, how to retain that trust. That is the broad parameters of what Professor Harishankar would be doing today. I will not be talking very much more, except that we will be moderating the session. A couple of inputs for the participants. There is a Q&A window to the left of your screen. If you do have questions as you are listening to him, please do enter those questions, and we will ask those questions to be asked usually at the end of the session. However, if there are questions that are extremely relevant to the subject that Professor has spoke about, and you wish to get an immediate clarification or express an immediate opinion or ask an immediate question, please raise that question in the Q&A, and since I'm moderating the session, I will interrupt. I have taken the liberty from Professor Harishankar to interrupt him so that the questions are answered at that time and will be retained in the memory of the participants. So over to you, Professor. We have discussed a period of about 35 to 40 minutes to complete the presentation, after which we'll go into the Q&A session. Over to you. Good luck. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very warm and genuine welcome. Can I request to grant me access to share the screen, please? Yes, thank you so much. I'll also mute my video in order to improve connectivity issues. Just a minute. All right. So thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss about challenges in both gaming as well as retaining parties' trust in the mediator. This is basically an overview of what we'll be discussing for the next 30 to 40 minutes. We'll start with exploring the implicit and explicit components of trust. We look at what are some of the common barriers to both developing and sustaining trust. We'll also look at ways, especially evidence-based practices, to overcoming barriers to building trust. So this is a broad overview of what we'll be discussing for the next 30 to 40 minutes. All right. Now, I come from a neuropsychology background. So if we look at these domains, trust and neuroscience, we have many pioneers in this field. But I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Zak, who has done innumerous experiments in this field of neuroscience and trust. So to begin with, what he did was he engaged participants in a trust game. A trust game is usually a behavioral economics game where we look at participants who are paired with each other, and we also request them to engage in some transactions. Now, please remember that these transactions are completely based on trust. So what he did was he sought permission to collect blood samples from these participants who were engaged in these games. And he tried to look at what are some of the biomarkers of trust, if any, that were present in these participants. So what he noticed was there is this hormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin predicted both how much the participants trusted others and how trustworthy they were. So this is a very unique and a significant finding, a biomarker for trust. It's a hormone that is usually secreted when a mother bonds with her child. Interestingly, when you eat chocolate, small amounts of oxytocin are also released in your body. It's also a feel-good hormone. When you hug your best friend, when you, let's say, cuddle with your partner, this increases bonding between these two individuals, primarily because of the oxytocin that is released as a part of this process. Now that he found a marker, okay, oxytocin is present in individuals who participated in these trust games, he also wanted to establish a cause and effect relationship between oxytocin and trust. So what he did was he artificially injected synthetic oxytocin. So he injected participants with synthetic oxytocin, and the findings were very remarkable again. It significantly reduced the fear of trusting strangers. So that was one of the remarkable cause and effect relationship between how this hormone oxytocin is responsible for, or at least partially responsible for, developing trust in another individual. Now, if you are interested in knowing more about his work, at the end of this presentation, I have added a link to a Harvard Business Review article. It's titled "The Neuroscience of Trust." All of you can access this link. Similarly, he has also written books which I would definitely recommend. The first one is called The Moral Molecule, which talks about how trust works. So if you are interested in these experiments that I just briefly described, you can definitely go through this book. The other book, which is titled The Trust Factor, talks about application of his research to industries and organizations. So I would definitely recommend these two books. I'll pause for a moment and just check if everything is clear and if we have any questions about the studies that we just described. Any questions or can I go ahead with the presentation?
We have not received any questions so far, Professor. You can go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the feedback, sir. All right. So moving on. So we spoke about hormonal levels or biomarkers of trust, basically looking at how oxytocin is involved in bonding and developing trust. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, so on one hand, we have individuals trusting each other. On the opposite end is threat perception. Now, what do we mean by threat perception? It's basically when you notice either a real or a perceived threat. Now, a real threat would be something like a wild animal coming to attack you. When you find yourself drowning in water, that would be classified as real threats. Now, what are perceived threats? You perceive that you'll be fired because of, let's say, a poor performance. You perceive that your relationship is going to end because your partner hasn't contacted you for 2 days and you feel that they are angry or upset at you. So the primary difference is, one is a real threat to your life and the other one is an imagined threat, or it could be a perceived threat. However, irrespective of whether the threat is real or imagined, our brain is wired to respond in the same manner. So it doesn't distinguish between a real threat and a perceived threat. It treats all threats equally, and unfortunately, it reacts in the same manner. So if you look at the screen, you will see a small pea-sized structure named as the amygdala. Pardon me, this is the last slide on such neuroscientific jargon before I move into mediation and other trust-related issues. Now, why I'm highlighting this aspect is it's automatic, as in the threat perception. You don't consciously think whether this is a real threat or whether this is an imagined threat, or should I be, attacking this threat? Should I be fleeing away from this threat? No, you don't get enough time to think. This structure, the amygdala, is a part of the larger structure called as the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is primarily responsible for emotions, especially negative emotions such as fear or anger and other such negative emotions. When we perceive a threat, what does this limbic system do? It activates what is called as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic part of the brain. So one part of this brain creates anxiety responses. So you'll notice that your muscles are getting tense, you find yourself stumbling, you find yourself sweating, your mouth goes dry. These are all symptoms of anxiety that are automatically activated. And then you have the other form of the nervous system, which when the threat disappears, or when you are away from the threat, it tries to calm down the anxiety symptoms that we just witnessed. Now, what is the role of threat perception in trust? If an individual experiences any cues of threat perception, for example, it could be any cue of danger. Now, to give you a more specific example, now let's say the individual perceives that the mediator may not keep the information that they have shared with the mediator confidential. Now, this could be a threat perception. This could be a cue which indicates threat. Now, whenever an individual experiences threat, it is very difficult for the individual to trust the other person. It's like you cannot be anxious and relaxed at the same time. Similarly, you find it very difficult to trust when you're experiencing threat perception. Okay. Now, this is again not very specific to mediation, but researchers on trust have classified this construct into 3 types, and all these 3 types have different levels of intensity associated with them. Now, for example, the first one is called calculus-based trust. Now, don't be overwhelmed by looking at this term calculus. Trust me, it's nothing to do with algebra or calculus. Denotes the calculated risk that we usually take, especially in a strange situation. Say, for example, you would want to choose a hospital for a specific form of treatment, and let's say there are 3 options that are available. Now, you take a calculated risk based on different parameters, and then you delve deep into the situation. You trust this individual or the hospital or the organization, and you decide to avail their services. Now, it's not completely a blind form of trust. It is a calculated form of trust. Why is this a calculated form of trust? Because there exists a certain structure, certain regulations and guidelines that can save this individual in case something goes wrong. So we'll just briefly look at the definition. A low-level form of trust that results when someone carefully calculates that they have more to gain than to lose. This is also based on an expectation of the other party's behavior that is based on sanctions, penalties, rewards, or even routine. Now, to give you another practical example of this, let's say, my bike encountered some problem, and I have to leave my bike with a local mechanic. Now, he doesn't give me a guarantee. He doesn't give me anything in return, stating that I have given this bike for servicing. Now, that's a calculated risk that I'm taking. I have this guy's phone number, I have this person's location, and if something goes wrong, I also know that I can probably file a police complaint, which can damage this person's goodwill or reputation, and which can also affect other trade practices in the future. So this is very superficial, based on certain guidelines, sanctions, penalties, rewards, or routine. I mean, you typically, or everybody typically leaves their bike with the mechanic with the trust that they will repair it and they will hand it over to you probably the next day or whenever they say it will be ready. Okay, now the second one is a little more in depth. It is also called as knowledge based trust. So, what kind of knowledge are we talking about? This is based on marketing, this is based on experience. So, for example, if I ask my friend, I'm new to the city, would you recommend a hospital to, get my eyes tested? Now he would say, I have been seeing this ophthalmologist for the past 15 years. I would definitely recommend this person. All my family members who've had some form of an eye issue sought help from this professional. So I would definitely recommend this person. Or let's say, I've had previous experiences with this person. So such previous experiences or knowledge which I acquire from other trusted sources can lead to a knowledge-based trust. Now, to give you an example, a definition of this, it is based on information each party has that enables them to foresee the probable consequences of a proposed solution. Okay, this person is recommending this dentist or let's say some other specialist. So with this recommendation, at least with some probability, I can anticipate the probable consequences. Okay, it will be a good experience. I'm not hoping to encounter a bad experience. So the feeling of knowing a person is based on the predictability or unpredictability of the behavior, and this is based on previous experiences that you have had with this individual, or it could be based on recommendations from trusted parties as well. Now, the last form of classification is basically identification-based trust. Now, as they mentioned in the introduction, Biomac has certain core values. It is a non-profit organization, right? So when you encounter certain values that you can relate to, when you encounter certain principles that you feel that you can definitely relate to, or certain value systems that you personally believe in, and when you notice that the other party also has similar or shared values of interest, this is basically identification-based trust. So we find it easier to trust people or organizations who are like us, and conversely, we might distrust people because they are different from us. And you will also notice that the level of trust varies across these three types of trust, ranging from the least intense, probably just a contractual form of trust in terms of the calculus-based trust, to a more in-depth form of trust in the last category, which is identification-based trust. Should I pause for any questions or can I go ahead with the presentation?
No, nothing has come in.
Right.
All right. One question, Professor, has come in.
Yes. I think I can see that question. How can a mediator identify whether an individual is facing perceived threat? It's a very good question, because ultimately we cannot decide whether a threat is real or perceived for the other individual. What we have to do is we'll have to validate that the person is feeling threatened by whatever. It could be, let's say, a dispute that this person is having with their spouse, or it could be, let's say, the threat could stem from the mediator themselves or the organization themselves. So what is very important, or what can help in these situations, is two things. One, if you notice these early signs of distancing, which we'll discuss in depth soon, be as open and intervene as early as possible. And you can substantiate it with evidence. I've noticed that you've been giving very brief answers to the questions or the discussions that we have been having. Is there anything bothering you? Or you can be very direct as well. Is there something that you would want to share with me? Is there something that is making you feel anxious? So noticing such early signs as early as possible and intervening then and there by using open-ended questions can help us understand whether the client, the party, and the mediator are on the same platform, or is the mediator assuming that everything is fine with the client and they proceed to the next step? We'll be discussing these issues in detail in the next few slides as well.
So the next question, do not worry about that, relates strictly to mediation. We will answer that at the end of it, about the opening statement. Please go ahead.
All right, great. All right. Now, looking at why is trust essential in mediation, the initial few responses may seem quite commonsensical, quite straightforward and self-explanatory, because in a trusting relationship, parties are more likely to share important information rather than being a bit hesitant about sharing such information. They are also less likely to be defensive. They're able to state their needs as specifically as possible, and more importantly, they're able to state their needs without feeling judged. So they may not have a second thought, what if I share this need and I feel judged by the mediator or the organization? Similarly, they'll also be more willing to give as well as take in negotiations, and be more accepting of the mediator's actions. This will also help us to bridge the gaps between them. But what is more important is having a trusting relationship creates a climate that is conducive to conflict resolution. Now, parties may probably seek our help with a specific objective, and very often it can revolve around different aspects of conflict resolution. So, having a trusting environment establishes a strong baseline on which you can build and create a climate that is conducive to conflict resolution. Right. Now moving on to the next section, which is basically looking at challenges in gaining and retaining parties' trust. So what are some of the challenges? And we'll also look at the different sources that these challenges stem from. So for example, there could be challenges that stem from the client's or the party's perspective. There would be challenges that may stem from our own perspective, let's say the consultant or the mediator's perspective. And there could be challenges that may stem from the environment, as in the environment in which the mediation takes place. So to give you a few examples of client-related sources and the challenges that may stem from them, these are few examples. Now, earlier we spoke about a client having apprehensions about their confidentiality. How can I trust that whatever I share with you will remain confidential? I mean, we have spoken about confidentiality, but I still have my apprehension. So this is a genuine fear. This could be also interpreted as a perceived threat, and we'll have to validate that, and we'll also have to probably give more concrete evidence to deal with this. Similarly, there would be concerns about fees. I mean, I still remember, a client asking me when I started out my practice almost 8 to 10 years ago. My fee per session was 100. To give you an idea of or to give you another context, the average fee that a psychologist, a clinical psychologist may charge now can range anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500. So when you have such a low fee, or when you are offering pro bono services, why are you not charging me anything? The client may question our value. I mean, usually we associate low values with cheap products and services. So this can stem, an apprehension or a lack of trust can stem from their perception of their fees. So you may have to probably explain why you are charging no fees, or why such a low fee, or why you have a scale of fee as well. Sometimes clients may question our expertise as well. I mean, I have faced this issue when I began family therapy. Most of my students in group supervision talk about this issue, where you haven't been married, so how can you understand problems that a couple is facing? Or you don't seem to have children, how can you offer child psychotherapy? Or you don't seem to have any issues in your marriage, so how can you understand issues that a couple is facing? Or there could be many other factors which may make a client question our competence, question our expertise, and this can also lead to a lack of trust between the party and the mediators. this. Similarly, there could be certain attitudes. For example, a client may come to a session with a preconceived notion. All psychologists are like this, all lawyers are like this. They may not even probably get to difference between a mediator and a lawyer. So, so those kind of preconceived notions and attitudes can also act as barriers, and we may have to address them. Sometimes the client may be facing a motivational issue. So the client, even before seeking mediation, may have already made a decision to either separate or some other decision for that matter. And this decision can influence the client's motivation, and they may not actively participate in this. We discuss in detail more about these issues in the next few slides. Similarly, consultants or psychologists and mediators may also have their own apprehensions. For example, the body language that we use to communicate. Communication patterns itself. Is our communication open and transparent? The third point on the screen, self-efficacy, is very important. It's something that I have personally experienced when I was a novice in this field. Many of our students talk about this issue, self-efficacy. So what is self-efficacy? The belief that I'm capable of doing a particular task. I'm able to handle this mediation session well. I'm able to offer a good session of family therapy to this couple. Sometimes we may have our own apprehensions. Oh my God, these are VIP individuals. Will I be able to, have a discussion with them, or will I be anxious? This person is very intimidating by their body language. So all of these factors may lead us to question our own self-efficacy or our own belief that yes, we'll be able to do this. And if we are not sure, or if there are any apprehensions, it will automatically reflect in our interaction with them. Similarly, how warm and empathetic the consultant is can also influence this. Similarly, the environment can trigger a lot of threat-inducing cues. For example, you notice that the door is not closed when you are having a confidential session and you see somebody, or let's say the party sees somebody walk past. Or let's say when you're having a session, the phone rings and the party notices that you're talking to some other individual. So such cues which may stem from the environment can also trigger threat-inducing cues, and this may also affect the overall trust that the party has with the consultant or the mediator. Right. Overcome these challenges. The interesting hypothesis that I came across while reading on mediation, and especially developing trust in this, and this is also relevant in the field of psychotherapy that we usually practice. Now, what this hypothesis says is parties open up once they trust that the mediator has no incentive to harm them, and the probability of reconciliation through mediation then increases. So they notice that you don't have any ulterior motives, you are there for the best interest of all the parties involved, and you basically do not have any incentive to intentionally harm them. Now, in this hypothesis, the mediator's goal is not to build trust, but rather to refute mistrust. So block all signals that may trigger a threat, block all signals that may induce mistrust. That is one way of looking at this. So if you look at these three levels, there is negative, there is neutral, and there is positive. Negative is when there are perceptions of threat. Neutral is the client is not threatened, neither has a good enough trust in the mediator. So we start by ruling out all cues of mistrust, taking the client or the party from a state of distrust to at least a neutral stance. So to begin with, it's not to build trust, but rather to refute mistrust. And the barrier to opening up is removed once parties no longer mistrust the process. However, we don't stop at removing all cues of mistrust. There are other things that we need to focus on in order to improve the user experience, which we'll be soon discussing. hypothesis, the third party dissolution hypothesis, is something that we experience a lot in family therapy. In family therapy, we call this process as triangulation. So what is this hypothesis? When two individuals are in a conflict, now let's say a husband and a wife are involved in a conflict and they are seeking some form of remediation, some form of help, either to resolve this conflict or to get separated. Now, there is a high chance that there is enough tension and anxiety between these two individuals, between both these parties. In this example, the husband and the wife. So what usually happens is this anxiety gets transferred to a third party. It could be a clinical psychologist, it could be a lawyer, it could be let's say some other members of their extended family, and this third party or this third individual gets triangulated into this. Now what happens as a consequence of this triangulation? The party, in this example the husband and the wife, may become extremely passive. They will transfer all responsibilities of resolving their conflict to the third party. We have come to you, you tell me what to do. Sir, you have listened to me, now please guide us, what should we do in order to deal with this? Or don't you think I am the right individual in this person and the other person is wrong? They are always making mistakes. So they seek validation. They expect that you will solve this problem for you. So conflict tends to polarize relationships, and very often third parties are included in this dynamic. And as a result, too much trust in the mediator can activate the third party dissolution mechanism, and in such cases mediators are perceived as allies. Okay, I think this person is with me and they know that I am the right person in this relationship and the other party is wrong. I'm sure that this mediator is my ally and not the other parties, and this again polarizes the relationship. And as a consequence of this, what happens is a party may therefore adopt a very passive attitude and believe that the mediator will move the other party, the mediator will solve this issue, and they can probably take a backseat and take a very passive attitude into this. Right. Now, for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll be briefly discussing these two very interesting pieces of research. One which is titled "What Makes Parties Trust Mediators." It was published 10 years ago, almost 11 years ago, in this Negotiation Journal, July 2009. So this individual has interviewed 105 individuals who were parties to mediators. They've looked at corporate issues where the employers and the employees have faced issues and they have sought help from mediators. After this, we'll also look at this very recent article which was published last year, 2019. This article focuses on family mediation, mediators and disputing parties' perception of trust building in family mediation. So let's start with the first article and look at what have they suggested to overcome trust-related issues, both in terms of gaining trust as well as in terms of sustaining that trust once you have developed that rapport and trust with your party. Right. Now what we have done is they have interviewed these 105 individuals, both employers and employees. They have initially started with a questionnaire, a brief questionnaire, and based on these the responses to the questionnaire, they have classified individuals into two categories. There was a high trust group which showed that the parties had high trust in their mediators, and on the other hand, you had a low trust group where the parties involved, both employers and employees, did not have enough trust with the mediators. So that was the first step of their study. So they identified 36 mediators, and through these mediators, they identified these 105 individuals, employees and employers, and they divided them into these two categories. Now, following this, they were asked to describe their experience with the mediator. So if they responded saying that they had a high trust on their mediators, they were requested to describe that experience in as much detail as possible. And similarly with the other group, the low trust group. They were also asked to describe whatever negative experiences they had, which led to a lack of trust in the mediator. Now, they received a lot of responses, and they have clustered all of these factors into 17, they have identified 17 such factors, and they have clustered these 17 factors into 3 categories. So the first one that you see on the screen, core factors, they refer to factors with above average frequency and also with statistically significant differences between these two groups. So they were significantly present in one group but not in the other, and they were also more frequently stated by most members in that group. So what core factors did they identify which can help in both building as well as sustaining trust? One of the most important aspect was mastery, as in the perceived competence of the mediator. So, and the description is basically a verbatim of what the participants have reported. The mediator inspires confidence due to their experience with the mediation process and the grasp of the case. So the most important factor is the perceived competency. Then moving on, competence alone is not enough. The explanation process. So how did the mediator take them through the entire process? Did they explain the process of mediation? Did they explain the different steps associated with the process? So the mediator inspires confidence by explaining some or all of the mediation process to put the party at ease. Then comes warmth and consideration, which is also considered as empathy. So the mediator inspires trust by being warm and showing genuine consideration. You're genuinely interested in the party and seeking a resolution to the conflict or the case that they have brought into this discussion. So you genuinely offer warmth, and you are genuinely empathizing with their client, trying to understand what they're going through, and you're considerate enough. Now, this is a very interesting concept, quite famous with our Bollywood movies, love at first sight or other such cliches. So this talks about the first interaction, or rather the first impression. So and this is not based on a lot of analysis and thinking and decision making. This is purely based on instinct. Remember the limbic system and the amygdala that we discussed earlier. So if the limbic system doesn't perceive the mediator as a source of threat, there would be an instant connection. So the party instinctively trusts the mediator as a source of the initial contact. So in this study, they have also spoken about how the first impression matters a lot. Then the last factor in this section, the core factors, is has a negative impact on the mediation process and the trust that leads to the resolution. So if clients have noticed that the mediator is partial, is not neutral to all parties who are involved in this process, then that is considered to be a negative, to be having a negative impact on the relationship. So the first 4 factors, mastery, explanation, warmth and consideration, and chemistry, were found to be significant in the high trust group, and this was found in the low trust group. It was significantly different, and it was also reported with above average frequency. Now, the second classification that now if you're interested in knowing more about the chemistry experience, there's this very interesting book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. He's also written other interesting books such as The Tipping Point, What the Dog Saw. So in this book, he talks about the first impressions and how connections are made even without having a conversation. So I would definitely recommend this book as well. Right. So moving on to the next set of factors, they talk about salient factors. And what are salient factors? These are factors with above average frequency, but no statistically significant difference were found between these two groups. And these include 3 factors. One is impartiality, which is basically the opposite of what we just discussed earlier. The mediator inspires trust by remaining impartial and giving both parties an equal opportunity to talk without judging. So unconditional regard is very important here. Understanding the mediator inspires confidence through their capacity to thoroughly grasp the facts and the party's perspective. Now, the third one is also important. What is the focus of the session? The parties perceived the mediator to be extremely focused on the settlement rather than probably beating around the bush or discussing other irrelevant topics in these sessions. So the mediator inspires confidence through their ability to focus discussion on finding potential solutions. The last category with the marginal factors, they were not reported quite frequently and they were not statistically different as well. However, they seem to be relevant in this concept of building trust. So these include 6 factors. One is advice. The mediator inspires confidence by informing the parties about the consequences of their choices, actions, or decisions. Legal expertise. The mediator inspires confidence through their knowledge of the law and the legal information that they provide. Composure. So the attitude which the mediator takes, are they calm and composed through the session, or do they become overwhelmed due to whatever factors? It could be time factor, there is an urgent case that needs to be resolved, or it could be certain personalities, or let's say certain traits associated with the parties which can disrupt the calm and composed nature, leading to anxiety and some other factors as well. They also talk about open and transparent communication, and another factor that is negatively impacting trust is perceived inexperience. So the mediator may lose a party's confidence by not intervening enough or showing signs of inexperience in the mediation process. Now, this is also important. The last one, choice. The mediator inspires trust by stressing that the parties are not under an obligation to reach an agreement. So the mediator is not imposing any personal values or views. The mediator is not forcing the party to take a decision. The mediator gives enough space and time, depending on the context, to help the client facilitate a decision-making process rather than imposing a decision on them. Now, the second study, I won't go into detail about this study. The second one, negotiation and conflict management research. The first one was conducted in Canada. It was basically looking at employee and employers' conflicts and how the mediators helped in the conflict. The second study was conducted in Spain almost a decade later 2009. And they looked at family-related disputes, and they focused on both parties, that is the mediators and the parties who were involved in this. They also took a similar approach, although the sample size was quite low here. It was around 54 here, whereas in the other study, they had about 105 participants. They also took a similar approach. They screened participants who had high trust in their mediators, and they also asked them to narrate their experience, describe their experience with the mediator in as much detail, and not surprisingly, the factors overlapped with the earlier findings, and they were able to identify 8 such factors, which include the mediator's legal expertise, suggesting an advice or alternative, sincerity, how honest, committed, and sincere the mediator is, their focus on settling the dispute. Now, this was something that was not found in the previous study. The appointment of a mediator by the public authorities or by a recognized service. Who is appointing the mediator? That becomes a very important factor if we are talking about parties who voluntarily seek some form of help from mediators. So who assigns these mediators are also very important according to the study, focusing on the parties' common goals, highlighting the roles of mediation, and devoting time to talking about informal matters as well. So These were the, sorry, there's a typo here. In the seventh point, I had merged both the seventh and eighth point. These are separate. Um, all these papers are available. I'll be sharing this with the organizers, and you can definitely take a look at these studies. Very interesting, very easy to understand studies as well. This is a shot from the same paper, the second paper, which focused on certain trust building factors, and other authors, right from 1988 or even before that, 1985, to more recent, and their reviews on these factors. So you'll notice that there's a pattern, and one very important pattern that was noticed across these studies. It's not the mediators, legal stance or their knowledge or those other technical aspects. It depends on whether the individual is humane enough, is compassionate enough, is considerate enough, is sincere enough, and these factors are applicable not only in the case of mediation but across any service related process. Right. So revisiting those three categories that we had discussed earlier, I'll wrap it up soon. I think I'm overshooting time a bit. There are about 10 more minutes, probably about 10 more slides. Right. So how can you develop calculus-based trust? So having clear and visible guidelines, for example, having things written rather than an oral discussion of confidentiality. Similarly, making other guidelines clear and visible will ensure that you can enter into a contract with the mediator, and you can trust the mediator, so that in case if something goes wrong, these are the options that I have. Now, knowledge-based trust. How do we develop a reputation? How do we develop a brand? How do we develop goodwill? It's all about building a personal brand. So, for example, you can have a website for yourself which talks about your achievements, which can also include, clients' experiences, their narrators about availing your expertise and your service. It could be word of mouth marketing. So basically, it's all about building a personal brand. Identification based trust. Again, you can use the same website, or let's say if you're using a brochure or a pamphlet, or let's say if you're hosting webinars like this, or anywhere where you are visible, you can talk about your core values, mission statement, and the values which this particular organization has. It is something that many can be proud of. It is something that many individuals can relate to, and it makes it easier for individuals to trust this organization and the mediators who are associated with the organization as well. So these are short rules of thumb, along with whatever was discussed earlier, those core factors that can be useful in developing trust. Now, when I was researching for this webinar, I came across a couple of websites which offered information, at the same time offered opportunities to schedule an online appointment or other resources, how to contact them. So these images that you see on your slide are examples of screenshots of websites that offer such services, and they are also quite open about their core values, about what the clients have to say about their expertise. So it's all a part of building credibility, and it's not a one-day phenomenon. It will take time, and it will evolve eventually. This is an example from India, Mediate India, mediation events. I think this is a UK-based service. Yeah, these are other examples as well. Okay, now moving on. This article, again, which is involved in this, which I've shared with this PPT, all of you will be able to access the complete article and the PPT. This talks about a slightly different platform. Online trust. Now, because of the restrictions and other such conditions, you may not be able to face a client in person, meet a client in person. So how about offering mediation related services online? How do you build trust? So this is a very good article written by Graham Ross. He also has a website of his own. It's called the mediationroom.com. But they talk in detail about the issues related to privacy. For example, is this platform encrypted? Are there chances of other individuals hacking into the system? So when we talk about privacy, or let's say maintaining records in person, a physical copy of the notes that we have taken, or the files that we have created for our clients, and online storage of data, there would be different and unique challenges to privacy. There could be technological challenges. For example, what if there's a disruption in the network? Those kind of challenges, and how to address those challenges as well. However, they don't look at this only as a problem related to privacy or technological challenges. They also consider this as an opportunity. For example, you can have a blind betting, anonymous brainstorming and dispute analysis without revealing your identity. So such kind of additional opportunities are also present when we talk about adapting mediation and negotiation techniques to the virtual or online environment. Right. Yes, this is the last part. I think there are about 2 or 3 more slides. The same author, Jean, who had conducted the study in 2009, who came up with core factors and salient factors, marginal factors, they also did a follow-up, and they came up with this very interesting counterintuitive finding. Are we, focusing on this aspect too much? Where do we draw the line? When do we stop? So in this abstract, the highlighted part talks about a threshold. So there's not a linear relationship. So higher the trust, better the resolution, or better the overall experience. No, it's not like that. They talk about a threshold point. So there is a threshold point rather than a linear relationship between the level of trust in the mediator and the degree of conflict resolution. And once the threshold has been reached, additional trust does not necessarily result in a higher level of conflict resolution. So, which means our sole objective shouldn't only be on building more and more trust. After a point, we also have to look at other factors. And in this paper, they also share this very interesting graph which illustrates their hypothesis. So this talks about the degree of resolution by employee level of trust in the mediator. So you can see that after it reaches this area, there is a plateau. As in, even if the trust increases on the x-axis, the degree of resolution doesn't increase in a linear fashion. So after a particular point of time, you reach a threshold after which it plateaus, and it may not have an impact on the overall experience, including conflict resolution. So what are some of the practical implications after reviewing some of these research and other aspects of trust, including the neuroscientific aspects of trust? Mediators devote their expertise to other aspects of the process rather than trying to further decrease the level of trust once the threshold has been reached. However, in the same article, they say that there is no objective way to understand when the threshold has been reached. It's basically your own judgment using your own discretion. The impression that trust in the mediator is a linear relationship with the likelihood of reaching an argument may make some mediators hesitant to confront the parties. Now, in my early days, I found it very difficult to confront a client who did not, let's say, engage in a homework assignment, or let's say if the couple were asked to engage in an activity, let's say spend some quality time with each other, and if they had not performed that activity, I found it very difficult to challenge this, to confront them. Now, this is where my underlying assumptions, acted as a barrier. What if I confront them, it can lead to a conflict, and I will lose their trust, or what will they think of me as a therapist? So that kind of a cognitive barrier, thoughts can actually make individuals hesitant to confront the parties out of fear of losing their trust. And this last point is the most important application of this. Once the threshold has been reached, the mediator can become more confrontational if necessary, or directive in guidance without being afraid of overly offending the parties. So this assumption that what will they think of me, or can I confront the party, or those kind of apprehensions can be silenced, and you can be a little more assertive, and if required, be directive as well. This article also talks about two things. So, this can also be considered as a key takeaway from this webinar. If we want to improve, the trust that our parties have in us, and also to sustain their trust, these two suggestions can help in that process. Now, some of us with experience or with our own knowledge and skills would already be practicing some of these techniques that are discussed here, and it can serve as a good validation. And if you have any other suggestions or any other experiences that you've had with respect to this, I'll be very happy to listen to your experiences in such situations as well. So practical implications, two such implications: guide parties and demonstrate your experience as a mediator. Parties need to know that the mediator will be able to guide them through mediation, a process with which they are typically unfamiliar, and one that often leads to an impasse. Taking the time to explain mediation and demonstrating experience can be an important step in the trust relationship. The other suggestion that the authors offer include being warm and considerate toward the parties, but avoid displaying partiality. So parties often prefer a mediator who is warm and considerate, but it is also at the same time critical that in showing empathy, the mediator avoids appearing biased towards one party, which again risks losing the confidence of the other party. The art of mediation involves finding that elusive balance between showing enough empathy to win trust, but not so much empathy as to indicate bias. It could be both positive as well as negative bias. Also, a party's trust evolves progressively. Both the mediator and the party, they're testing waters. To what extent can they make themselves vulnerable, especially the party? Can I make myself vulnerable to disclose sensitive information? Can I trust this individual? So it is a evolving process. Although we spoke about the first contact or the first impression, however, that impression can change over time, and it's an evolving process. These are my references. I'll make all of these accessible, including the PPT. This is a curated list of websites that can offer us more suggestions. The first one, the Neuroscience of Trust, the Harvard Business Review article. This is where Paul Zak talks about the experiments that he conducted to arrive at this conclusion that it was oxytocin that played a very important role. He even made a cause and effect claim between oxytocin and trust. And these are other references or other websites that we can access. I'd like to end this webinar with this quote, which is again from the article that I just discussed. It takes less time to lose trust than to earn it. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take.
Thank you, Professor. Two observations. One, that I think you're almost a mediator right now. Congratulations.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Right.
And I don't know whether on these online platforms there is a way of the participants giving you an ovation. Please rest assured that all of us will give you a thunderous round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure, sir.
Now there are a few questions that I would like to take you through, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. The first one has been, I think you've already answered it.
Yes.
But there's a different dimension of that question. He says in a mediation, if there are two parties to a mediation,
right,
and one comes into the mediation with complete trust in the mediator,
right,
and the other one does not have any kind of trust in the mediator,
Right.
And the mediator devotes a little extra time to build that trust with the other party, with the party who doubts his.
Yes. Yes.
Will
Huh.
it or will it not be perceived as
Uh,
favoritism, maybe loss of neutrality, maybe siding one party?
True, true. I think that's a very critical question because not all parties will be equally trusting of the mediator. So, I would recommend two suggestions here. One, obtain consent. I mean, this is what we usually do in family therapy, where we take the consent of the party who is already trusting the mediator or the therapist to spend some time with the other person. So obtaining consent can be, one such suggestion. The other suggestion is, which is more important, address any apprehensions that the other party would be experiencing. So, for example, if let's say I spend 15 minutes extra with this person, and you seem to be already trusting this process, can you just think aloud and talk about the apprehensions that you are experiencing right now? So, getting a clear and a more objective understanding of their apprehensions associated with favoritism, or is the mediator biased towards the other person, and that is why they are spending more time with the other party. So it'll be good if we can clear all these assumptions, take their consent, and then probably engage the other party.
Thank
One
you,
other
Professor.
thing.
The
Sorry,
second
sir.
question,
Yes, yes.
yeah, yeah. There is a second question that has been asked relating to the earlier one.
Uh-huh.
What is the relevance of body language of a mediator in building trust and retaining trust?
Yes, yes. I think it's very important. Now, this is something that we cannot consciously control because it's as if you're multitasking. Now, right now, I'm, let's say, talking to you, and I'm also gesturing, which thankfully many of you cannot see. So these gestures are not within my control. Sometimes they are a part of one's habit, and this is how we typically this thing. Now, in terms of body language, I would suggest there are three things that we need to be aware of. So, if we have a biased attitude, if we have a preconceived notion towards the party, oh my God, look at what this person has done. I'm sure this person should be punished, or let's say whatever. In any, it could be a positive or a negative bias towards one party. Or let's say you take the side of the victim. Oh my God, this person had to go through so much of torture, so much of difficulty. I think unconsciously, or rather subconsciously, there is a tendency to side with this person. So the first thing with respect to body language would be to identify and understand our own biases, our own attitudes, our own preconceived notions towards the parties, because very often not within our spectrum of awareness. It requires some degree of reflection. Why is awareness important? Because if we are aware of these biases, it will to some extent automatically prevent these biases getting translated into non-verbal gestures, which or other aspects of body language, which can be misinterpreted by the party. So being aware of our biases can be one thing. The second thing is, you can also ask for feedback after a session, or you can probably take the help of a colleague if you feel that body language is an issue, and there are a lot of unnecessary irrelevant gestures that we are engaging in when we are talking to our client. You can also get some form of video feedback after taking consent from a party. You can probably engage in a role play. And when we talk about body language, it's not only about the physical body language, such as gesturing, or are you lying in are you sitting in a very complacent position, appearing to be bored or disinterested. So there are different aspects of that, physical aspects of body language. A very other important aspect of body language is your paralinguistics. So we are saying things, but how are we communicating? Because the factors that we discuss, such as empathy or warmth and concern, they cannot be explicitly stated. They are a very important aspect of our body language, and these paralinguistic aspects, such as the use of certain terms. Now, to give you a very very practical example, the use of gender neutral terms. So some clients may be offended by the use of pronouns such as he or she. Or let's say, using some other gender related terms. So taking a gender neutral stance is also a very important aspect of our communication. So being aware of these biases, having some degree of control over the paralinguistic aspects of our speech. And the third aspect is, again, openly asking for feedback from the client, because you can notice, if we are observant enough, you will slowly and surely notice signs of distrust emerging. And if that is the case, you can openly, call for a discussion to see if your body language has communicated anything which you did not intended to communicate. For example, a client may say, I noticed you checking your phone frequently. I felt that you were not interested in me, or were you recording my session, right? So such aspects of body language and other behaviors become very important. And yes, to answer your question in a single word or a single sentence, yes, body language is a very important aspect of building and sustaining trust.
Thank you, Professor. There is a tricky question here.
Okay.
It seems tricky to me.
All right.
The question is, how does trust enable, what are the factors that will help parties to trust and commit when they decide to resolve? Obviously, the presumption is that when you enter mediation, the level of trust is either zero or very minimal.
Exactly.
But what are these factors that will help to trust, and when they have agreed to resolve, what is the level of trust that is required?
I would probably require some clarification here. From a legal perspective, what do we understand by resolving?
A settlement, agreeing to resolve the dispute, that is in mediation, agreeing to the terms of settlement and so on.
Right. Okay, great. Right. So the question is, what are the factors that will help parties to trust and commit when they decide to resolve? Right. So starting from some of the most obvious core factors that we discussed earlier in terms of how competent you appear to the client. Similarly, let's say factors such as being warm, being open, and transparent in your communication. So all those core factors will definitely help us. Core factors and salient factors will help us in sustaining trust once the parties have decided to trust and commit.
Two quick questions before we close. I think we are running out of time, Professor.
Okay. All right.
One is this question, which is a very, very wonderful observation you made, and I think all the trainers in the country must note this. The emotion that must be conveyed is that mediator does not have any incentive to harm the parties, is one.
Right.
Then the effort must be not to build trust, but to refute mistrust.
Right.
I think that's a very brilliant comment. All the trainers in this country must take note of it. Second, Professor.
Yes, sir.
If there has been a complete level of trust at the end during the mediation proceedings, and the mediator does one act which dilutes that trust, what is the process for regaining that trust?
Exactly. Great. I think it's a very relevant question, because we often see this in the case of family therapy. We usually call it as an attachment injury. Now, this attachment injury could be very severe, such as when one of the partners cheats on their spouse. Or it could be between the therapist and the client. The therapist may have made a remark which has hurt the client, or let's say, unknowingly tried to impose a religious value, or let's say a political stance, or something else which can, like you rightly said, break the trust of the client. What I have noticed in my practices is, let's not try to avoid it. Let's not treat it as an elephant in the room, saying that, probably time will heal this and let's continue as if nothing has happened. So it's best to address the issue, be as honest admitting as possible in admitting that mistake or whatever act. It could be a thought, it could be a behavior or an emotion, an emotional expression, which led to some form of dissolution of trust. So acknowledge it, accept if it's an unintentional, try explaining it, and if required, apologizing can also help in such situations. Because again, in my experience, when you apologize to a client for making a mistake, in fact, I've noticed that when I put myself in such a vulnerable position, the attachment actually increases, especially if the apology is sincere and you don't commit the same behavior or mistake again. So acknowledge, accept it, and then if necessary, address it. And one way of addressing would be to apologize for it and look at what are the repercussions of this lack of trust, and take a case-by-case approach to resolving those issues as well.
Thank you. And there's one final thing. Are you in a mood to answer that question, Professor?
Oh yes, definitely. I'll be happy. No problem.
There is this. I suspect this is a question which is going to cause some anxiety. What happens in a mediation when one of the parties trusts the mediator and the other one does not?
Right.
And irrespective of the result of the mediation, one of the parties who has trusted the mediator wants the same mediator over and over again in another mediation. You have answered this, but would you put it again? You have already answered this earlier. This is called identification-based trust.
Right. Great. I think this is also a great question because, like we discussed earlier, not all the parties involved in this process will have the same level of trust. Okay. Now, to begin with, there are again two things that we can do in such scenarios. If you notice cues that one person is not trusting the mediator, you can again address it. You can confront that situation in a very non-threatening manner. So we have been discussing for the past 15 to 20 minutes. Can I make an observation? I've noticed that one of you, or you can probably address them, be direct and address them by their name, is quite open and describe behavioral manifestations of trust, whereas the other person is not so trusting. Is there anything that is bothering you, or are there some thoughts that are running at the back of your head which is probably making you a bit apprehensive or even paranoid about the entire process? So addressing that directly will to some extent clarify the sources of mistrust. In one of those earlier slides we spoke about client related factors. Now let's say if a client has had previous experiences where their trust has been breached without their consent, and it has led to a situation where the client finds it very difficult to form a secure bond or even to trust the other individual. It could be the previous experiences which is leading to what the client is experiencing right now with you as a mediator, and it's nothing to do with your expertise or your skill per se. So first one would be to openly acknowledge it, and you can also take permission or make a disclaimer about you being incorrect about the observation. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is probably what I have observed, and you can clarify things and then work on building trust. The other thing which is equally important is, and I have noticed this when I was a trainee, when I was new into this profession of therapy, whenever I notice that somebody is refusing to be a part of this therapy process, I get a lot of apprehensive. I take it very personally. Oh my God, is it something which I have said? Am I a bad therapist because the session is not going smoothly? So it's equally important to understand our own thought processes and address any cognitive distortions, like we call them. For example, there could be a jumping into conclusion. The client did not make eye contact, so I feel that the client is not liking my session. There would be a need to please the client there would be a need to appear to be very competent. So addressing both our own thought processes as well as taking consent and addressing the issue can probably help in understanding. It may not really help in resolving because there is no one foolproof method to ensure that the client is trusting unless you inject oxytocin, which is again illegal and unethical. So I think
thank you, Professor.
Yes.
Welcome to the world of mediation, though I'm not sure you would welcome us into the world of psychology. But
yes, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been a very, very lovely and a great presentation. I'm going to hand this meeting back to Thiru right now.
Okay.
Thiru, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Shivkumar. This is Manik, and I will be doing the vote of thanks on behalf of Mr. Thiru. So I'd like to thank Professor Harishankar for his impressive speech and valuable contribution. These insights have been very helpful for us mediators. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Mr. Shivkumar for being an excellent moderator. I thank Mr. Thiru and Ms. Ramya for organizing this. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank all the participants for attending this webinar. Thank you very much. Stay safe and take care.